Hello everybody, today we're going to be doing an equipment tier list in World of Tanks, covering all the different kinds of equipment that there are, although I'm going to be using the best option for each class of equipment. So for example, the gun laying drive, I'm using the Bond gun laying drive instead of just a regular gun laying drive, because I just am assuming the best piece of equipment available for that specific option. So a Bond rammer instead of a regular rammer, etc. But I am throwing in experimental equipment as well, but I'm assuming that these are all tier 3 experimental pieces of equipment. Now this is just going to be a general video. Obviously all of this is my opinion, and this applies to random battles primarily, not competitive game modes. And I have to say that equipment is pretty well balanced in World of Tanks, so a lot of good players would very much disagree with me on a lot of my rankings. But I also want to say it depends a lot, obviously, what tank you're actually playing. So like medium tanks, E50M, I would probably put bond hardening on it instead of vents or something. But if I'm playing a Leopard 1, I might not do that. So it depends a lot on what tank you're playing. But I just want to make a general guide for all the different tank classes, and so that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be starting with light tanks, then going down this list here, and ranking for each vehicle class, because obviously if I put Commander's Vision System in necessary for a light tank on a heavy tank, you can't even mount it, and even if you could, you wouldn't want to mount it. So that's why I'm doing it by vehicle class. So first, let's get started with the light tanks. And I also want to say, if you have a question about what you want to put, what you should put on a specific vehicle, click on the link in the description, and in the comments probably. Hopefully I remember to put it in there, to this Discord. It's a coaching central. It's a Discord server where there's coaches who can, very good players who will answer your questions in this channel here, quick questions, telling you, for example, you ask, what do I put on my Leopard 1? You just ask it in this channel and we'll give you our opinions on that. So let's just get right into this now. I've talked long enough. Getting started with light tanks first. So light tanks obviously are going to want at least one loadout where they can spot. And so obviously the spotting equipment is all going to be higher up than, you know, the damage dealing and the survival equipment pieces. So first, improved aiming unit, or bounty aiming unit. I would put this in probably niche use or very good. This one, if you look at I'm looking at tier 10 light tanks. A lot of them can do damage as well as spot, so the 13105 is a good example of that. You definitely want a spotting loadout on this tank, but it's on its other loadout you have a little bit more room, because you might get a map where there's no bushes or there's not much spotting to be done and you just want to do damage. Aiming unit is not a bad option for that tank, but I would say it's mostly relegated to light tanks that have auto loaders, or that can't mount a rammer, or that are going to be sniping. So that's why I'm putting it in probably very good. I might switch up the orders after a while. Next we have binos. I'd put binos in niche use. The main reason why, unless you're playing a low tier which has poor V range, all the high tier light tanks have very good V range. Well, that's kind of relative, but they have like, if you put optics on them, which is my preferred piece of V range enhancing equipment, you're gonna have probably 500 or more V range, or somewhere around there. And 500 is just usually more than enough. In binos, since you have to sit still to activate them, it's just not worth it in most cases. Optics are just far superior, and that's why I'm putting it even below aiming unit. If it's your only option, it's definitely, you know, still better if you don't have optics, but just put optics instead. Next, I'd put Commander's Vision System. I'm going to put this in necessary because I believe that every single light tank, besides maybe the Sheridan, at least at tier 10 and at like tier 9 and high tiers, you want to have a full scouting loadout, which is low noise, Commander's Vision System, and optics. And that's pretty much without fail. So RHM Panzer, EBR, 13105, everything. I mean, ABR you could drop low noise for vents or something just for better V range, but this is just a standard piece of equipment for a light tank. Next, VSAB. I'm gonna put this one in probably honestly useful but better options towards the end of this list. I am going to be within the tiers ranking. Left side will be the best, right side will be the worst. V-stab, if you have your scouting loadout, which you bring on scouting maps, that's great. But for your secondary loadout, a lot of the time you're going to want gun handling equipment and equipment for doing damage. So you can still bring optics or something if you want to, or vents, or low noise. But you're probably gonna have at least one piece of damage dealing equipment for your second loadout. So ideally that will be rammer. Like on the EBR, I run rammer, vents, optics. But for example, 13105, you can't mount a rammer, and plus a V-stab is also just very useful. So I would run a V-stab instead. RHM Panzer, I run V-stab, vents, and rammer on my other loadout because it has great base view range. I don't think it needs optics. T100, I don't run V-stab because it has insane on-the-move firing abilities, so it doesn't really need a V-stab. But I would still put it in useful but better options. Gun lane drive, I would put this on never use. This is only useful on basically artillery. There's no other vehicles in the game where I would recommend using a gun lane drive, especially because the experimental fire control system, I'll just show it in the garage real quick, already gives you minus 9% to aiming speed, but also gives you part of a V-stab, which is way more useful. So GLD is basically just outclassed in every single way, and plus the light tanks do not have terrible aim times. And in general, even if they do, you're going to want a V-stab or an aiming unit or rotation mechanism or something else rather than gun lane drive. So I'd never pick this, and that's going to be the case for every class going forward besides artillery, which I'm not going to go over artillery. So next we have grousers. On light tanks, I would say never use this. Maybe niche use, but I'd say never use this. I can't think of a light tank that I would ever use this on. Turbo is just usually better, and turbo is not something you use on lights very often because you need your scouting loadout, which has the three pieces of equipment which are already predetermined: CVS, optics, and low noise. And so then for your second loadout, you might as well just bring turbo because it's probably going to be better. It's as simple as that. It will increase your top speed, which you frequently reach in light tanks, which grousers does not. Maybe an ELC even 90, but I just don't see it. Niche use, I'm gonna put hardening in there, behind vinos, because hardening is probably useless in light tanks. The only time I can ever think you would bring one is maybe on like a RHM Panzer for your damage loadout, but I just prefer gun handling equipment. Your base HP is already so low. Hardening is not good on light tanks in general. I would not recommend it. Improved config. The only tank I can ever think of using this on is an LT-432 because it gets set on fire so often and its fuel tanks get destroyed so often. And I would not even use it on that tank probably. And you can always use experimental hardening for that instead and get most of the benefits. So I'm going to put that in never use. Low noise, definitely up here. It's debatable which is better here. I'm just going to put low noise in front because I think sometimes I'll drop CVS, but I basically never drop low noise on my scouting loadout. Optics, I'm putting that at the top. Well, I'll put it behind low noise, I guess. I don't know. These are very close. Personally, I prefer optics to Commander's Vision System if I have to choose one. Usually, anyways. Because Commander's Vision System, you have to be within around 200 meters or closer in order for your Commander's Vision System to be useful at all. Optics is useful at all ranges. It does help you spot people through bushes. Optics does, but it's only like a quarter of the benefit that CVS gives you when spotting through bushes. But at long ranges, like 370 plus meters, a lot of tanks which are stationary or just TDs with high camo, or light tanks or medium tanks which are moving, optics will help greatly. And I would probably put it above low noise just because on tanks like the EBR, which really need the view range, it's just super helpful. but it's not super important. Just pick these three if you're ever in doubt in a light tank. Now for the radio set, this one's tricky because I haven't actually used it that much, but I did use it quite a bit on like a test server in the EBR. What I found is it occasionally helped, but just compared to these three are just way too powerful for this to have any use. Maybe if these got nerfed a little bit, like CVS got nerfed, but in their current state, I can't see myself ever picking this. In fact, I'm just going to put it down here. Rammer, I'm going to put this in useful but better options. For your damage loadout on light tanks, Rammer is definitely a good option. It's probably the primary option that you want on the EBR, on the T100, on the RH Panzer. So I'm actually going to put it above V-Stab if I can. Rotation mechanism. This one I'm going to put in niche use. I can't think of a single light tank that I would put a rotation mechanism on, unless you count the Barask as a light tank. Rotation mechanism is usually only helpful on tanks that are autoloaders, which can't mount a rammer, so that frees up an equipment slot to use something else, and which are autoloaders so that when you fire your first shot, your bloom is reduced. It doesn't bloom out as much because the rotation mechanism counteracts that. And also if you turn slowly. So yeah, only like a Barask, which isn't really a light tank anyway. Spall liner, useless. Never use this piece of equipment. It's just bad. It doesn't decrease the HE damage you take from penning HE shots, which is mostly what you're going to be dealing with in light tanks. And if you want to survive more HE shots, just bring hardening, because it just gives you a flat % bonus to HP. Why would you pick this stuff? Like, it's just not worth it. It is not helpful. Camo net. This, in my opinion, is like a worse version of low noise. I'm going to put it in niche use. Maybe right here. I can't think of a single reason, especially if you have bounty low noise, why you would ever use camo net, because bounty low noise gives 9%. And camo net, I think boosted gives 13%. Let's see. 12.5%, not even 13%. So you get like 3.5% extra camo, but you can only use it when you're sitting still, which is the time when you need it the least, really, because you're going to be sitting in a bush. You don't need the extra camo when you're sitting in the bush usually. You need the extra camo when you're driving through the open to get to the bush. So camo net is just, it's not good. People think it's good. I would not use this on any tank in the game, honestly. The only reason I'm putting it in niche use is maybe in clan wars or something, or you just don't have a low noise. Even a regular low noise is better than camo net, just to clarify. But turbo, I'm gonna put this in very good above the aiming unit. There are some light tanks which benefit from turbo. ELC even 90 is a good example. Its gun is so trash, it's hardly even worth bringing a gun loadout for doing damage. So what I do on that tank is I'll bring the classic scouting combination. But then on my second loadout, sometimes what I'll do is run a turbo, and then I'll run optics low noise or something, just so that I can get to some early game bushes quicker. But in general, turbo is not a super strong piece of equipment on light tank, just because they're already so fast, and the extra speed isn't super useful, because they can already get to where they need to go very quickly, and they'll get there before all the enemies anyways, so it doesn't really matter. Sorry about these pings. Vents. I'm going to put this right here. This is a good piece of equipment. Some light tanks can switch out low noise or one of these pieces of equipment for vents, usually low noise or CBS, especially the EBR, which needs the extra view range, but it's also a really good piece of equipment just for general helpfulness with your damage loadout, just for increasing your DPM while also giving you some view range and, you know, everything else really. Improved hardening. I'm going to put this, okay, so this is experimental hardening. I'm going to put this above. I'm actually going to put this here. The reason why is because there's one tank I can think of where this might actually be an okay choice, the LT432, which increasing its durability of its fuel tanks would be very helpful, and so I could actually see myself potentially using it on that tank for my damage loadout. And in that regard, I think it's better than regular hardening because I can't think of a single time I would actually use regular hardening. This I actually can think of one potentially. Fire control system. I'll just quickly show you what that does, just in case you're wondering. So fire control system is like a gun lane drive and a V-stab combined into one. It's like 11/27ths of a V-stab, so a little under half, and like 3/4 of a gun lane drive, which is actually not too bad. Gun lane drive sucks. This thing is just better. However, I can't really think of a light tank where this would be helpful because most light tanks do not have like a TD, like a huge alpha TD gun or something, which has to aim for 10 seconds. They're all just, you know, small little shitter guns which do 300 damage or 400 damage. So this is just not very helpful. The best like situation I could think of for using this is like a T49 derp gun or something, or Sheridan derp gun. Fire control system. I'll probably just throw it in here somewhere, honestly. I think the regular turbo is probably going to be better on most cases because you're trying to get to an early scouting game position. That's the main reason why you would even bring the turbo in the first place. But it's kind of funny how this worked out. If you just look at the top two rows, these are probably the most common loadouts I have for light tanks. Is just one loadout, optics, CVS, low noise. Second loadout, you know, rammer, vents, and then either optics or low noise. Usually not low noise, but V-stab or aiming unit, or like on an ELC like turbo. Might switch these two, but yeah, that's pretty much it for light tanks. Let's go on to, let's see, we got medium tanks next. Medium tanks will be a little bit less straightforward. Okay, medium tanks, probably the hardest part of this entire video. I'm just gonna quickly throw some things in the trash tier, which I shouldn't have to explain much. So spall liner, this thing, if it's not good on lights, it's not gonna be good on mediums. Camo net, I'll throw there. Grousers, I'm sorry grousers, but there might be some medium tank where it's useful, but in general I would not recommend grousers. Binos, it's like the same as optics, it's just worse because you have to sit still for it to activate, which is not helpful at all, and you have more than enough view range unless you're low tier. Keep in mind, if you're like tier 4, tier 5, tier 6, binos could be helpful, but at high tiers they're not. Alright, now let's GLD, throw that in there. That's not going to be good. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes. Start with aiming unit. I'd put this as very good. So it really depends on which tank you're playing, but a lot of the time what you're going to be running on a medium tank, let's just pick a medium tank, 121. You're going to be running a rammer. You need to run a rammer on pretty much every medium tank for pretty much as your primary loadout. Then maybe vents and V-stab. And this is going to be a typical loadout for most mediums. You could also replace the vents with hardening. And this is going to be your main loadout. You can also run turbo on some medium tanks, but that's the main loadout. But a lot of the time for a second loadout, or just as your primary loadout, the V-stab and the rammer are usually essential on most medium tanks. And then it's just kind of about changing the third piece of equipment. So you can run vents, like I said, or hardening. But on some tanks, like the 121, for example, which is very bad, not very bad, but pretty bad full aimed accuracy, and aiming in it, I just prefer over vents. And then there are some rare cases of medium tanks where I believe you might be able to drop V-stab and just run vents, aiming unit, rammer, like a Leo 1, although I don't do this personally on almost any tanks. there are some cases where I think it might be worth it. And then there's medium tanks which have auto loaders which can't mount a rammer, and those ones you would run something like this: V-stab, vents, and then aiming unit. So that's why I'm putting it in the very good tier. It's often going to be on a second loadout or on a primary loadout of a tank with bad accuracy. CVS, I'm going to save that for last because I'm going to make a rant about it or something. Fire control system. I'm not entirely sure about this one, honestly, because I have not used it much. It sounds good on paper, kind of, but I wouldn't recommend it unless it's a tank. Unless, like, so first of all, V-stabs is better than this, and pretty much, yeah, just everything. Like, V-stabs is just a better option. And then you're going to want rammer, unless you can't mount a rammer, and so as a third piece of equipment, I would only recommend this on, like, things that can't mount a rammer, so like a Batchet. And even then, you could just run rotation mechanism or aiming unit or vents, and those will probably be better options, but I can't say for sure. I haven't used this enough, so for now I'm just going to put it in useful. Experimental hardening, I'm going to put this in probably very good. On some tanks like the 430U, this is pretty much necessary, which because they get fuel tanked all the time, or an ammo racked all the time. But it's just not a bad piece of equipment, especially when you compare it to regular hardening. I think they're both just really solid pieces of equipment. As a secondary loadout, oftentimes I'll be running hardening. I'll just run rammer, vents, V-stab, and then I'll run rammer, V-stab, and then hardening of some kind. I don't have many components, so I usually use bond hardening, or just hardening of some kind. But you can use the experimental hardening as well, especially on tanks that are prone to ammo racks and fuel tanks. Bounty turbo, I think this is another one which is a solid pick. Turbo is probably secondary to hardening as my medium tank third piece of equipment, because like I said, V-stab and rammer should basically be on every loadout for the most part. Not always, but it depends on the medium tank. But for the most part, if we just look at the medium tank list, tanks that can drop V-stab, arguably the E50M. I mean, maybe Senax. K91 probably can. Leopard 1 maybe. M60 probably can. 140 maybe, but I probably wouldn't. And that's pretty much it. Like, the rest I would all run V-stab on. So these two top tier. Rammer, on the rest of this list, it's going to be on the top. Only light tanks can drop it for something. On mediums, I would always run rammer on everything that can run rammer. Improved config, I think it's just kind of worse than the hardening, so I'm probably just going to put it in niche. I don't think I would run this on any tank. I would always just run this over it. Low noise, this one I think I'm going to put in useful but better options, but at like the top of this list, because I think there are some cases where it might be useful, but usually hardening or turbo are going to be better as your third piece of equipment. And so only on like a Barask or a Batchet would I potentially think about using this. And I would say the same for optics. And I'd put it, I don't know which order to put these in, but something like this. Rotation mechanism, I'm going to say the same for this. This one is only useful on, again, those autoloaders like Batchet and Barask. Because vents and aiming unit are generally better options, as well as hardening and turbo for that third piece of equipment, and these two are generally set pieces of equipment. Vents, I'm going to put it at the top of very good, because I think aiming unit and vents are pretty on par, and it depends on which tank you're on, which is better, kind of, but it's very much personal preference. So I would put them there. Bond turbo, I'm going to put that probably behind experimental turbo, because a lot of tanks, medium tanks, like the CS63, if you want to run a turbo loadout, this turbo is going to be better than this turbo simply because medium tanks are generally already pretty fast, so you don't need the extra top speed that the Bond Turbo offers, whereas on heavy tanks, the extra top speed from the Bond Turbo is very helpful, because you reach your top speed very easily. On medium tanks, you don't usually. Commander's Vision System. I know there have been a lot of content creators doing CVS loadouts on stuff. Honestly, I do not think it's that good. I think optics are actually just better, and I'll probably make a video eventually on that, why I think optics are just better in general. I know it's kind of controversial, but that's my opinion on that. Would I change anything about this list? Honestly, I don't think so. By the way, a lot of people run optics as their third piece of equipment. I don't think this is generally useful. I think I would do vents instead, because vents gives you that extra bit of view range, if you really want it. But if you have, like, if you're running food and a good crew which has situational awareness, brothers in arms, and recon, you're probably not going to need optics in order to get up to like 450 plus meters view range, and I think the extra view range after that is not super helpful usually. If you want to be a spotter, just play a light tank. There's no reason to make your 121 into a spotter tank. It's good on like 3 maps: Overlord, Fisherman's Bay, and honestly CVS might be useful on some maps like Proc or Murrow, but that's pretty much it. Like, a lot of the time, the extra view range and the ability to spot through bushes at close range is just not nearly as helpful. And for a second loadout, you'd much better off be running vents, aiming unit, hardening, or turbo. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that. Alright, let's go into heavy tanks. I think heavies are next, right? Yes. This one should be not too difficult. So on heavy tanks, mobility is much more of a concern. Getting to the fight is a much bigger problem because you're slow. So, I'm first of all, let's just say aiming unit. This one I'll save for later. Binos, never use that. I don't even know if, I think you can on heavies, but just no reason to. Might as well use optics, and optics are bad too. Cam on it, meh. I don't even know if you can use it on these tanks. Gunlane drive, no. Like I explained before, it's not as good. Radio set, you can't even use on heavies. CVS, you can't use on heavies, nor would you want to. Spall liner, don't use it on heavies. Like I said, just use hardening if you want to survive more HE shots. It's just better because it will always work, whereas this only works with HE, and it just sucks. It's just not good. Just trust me on that. The only time you would ever want to bring this is if you're getting pounded by arty in clan wars, and that's like your whole job is just to sit in one position and die to arty, and even then it's probably not worth bringing, honestly. So here we get to fire control system. I probably wouldn't use this. So on heavies in general, the kind of the shift away from medium tanks to heavy tanks, the main difference is heavies, turbos, and mobility equipment are better. Whereas on mediums, turbos are a little bit worse, but aiming equipment is a little bit better on medium tanks, because heavy tanks, you need the survivability of hardening of some kind, usually, but then you also need the mobility oftentimes. So it's kind of rammer, hardening, turbo as the primary loadout on most heavy tanks. The only exception is when you want to run V-stab. That's pretty much it. There are some exceptions, but in general, hardening is very good, so I'm just going to throw that in there. Turbos are very good. I'm going to throw these up here. Rammer, always the best. And I'll get to Grousers later, but Grousers even has a place on like an I-7, for example. So this is kind of the typical loadout. Turbo, hardening, rammer. Whether you want to pick bond rammer or bond hardening or experimental depends on which tank you're playing. Tanks that get ammo racked a lot, like the S-Conch or the E5, you might want to bring experimental. Tanks where you're going to expect to get tracked very often. IS-7, I always pick bond hardening because the extra track health that you get from this is more important in my opinion, and the extra health. And like a mouse, I would bring this as well. And then whether you bring experimental or bond turbo, I would probably put bond turbo above this. And I'd actually put turbos above hardening in general, actually. Because the top speed, the extra top speed you get is important, so they kind of flip-flop from medium tanks to heavy tanks, whereas bond turbo is usually better in my opinion. Not always the case. 57 heavy, for example, which really relies on its gun, not its armor, and which has poor gun handling. I definitely would switch them for that tank and for several other tanks, but for slow heavies, I would almost always pick this. That's not even true. I would probably, I don't know, it's hard to say. Even IS-4 and 60 TP, probably experimental is better. They're pretty close. Not a huge deal. Just pick one or the other based on personal preference. Grousers. I'm going to put this one in useful but better options because grousers are helpful, but only on a few tanks like the IS-7, which don't reach its top speed very easily and which have poor ground resistances, and oftentimes you're going to be using it in conjunction with the turbo anyways, so I kind of consider it worse than a turbo on almost all tanks because it doesn't give you the extra top speed and reverse speed bonus that the turbo does. And it's only marginally better than turbo on on like soft and medium terrain for some tanks, so if it's a bond turbo anyway. If you have a regular turbo and you're playing your i7, definitely put grousers over the turbo, but if it's a bond turbo, I think it's more debatable. Improved config. I'll still put it in niche use because I don't know how this got there. Because experimental hardening is just better usually. Low noise, I'm gonna put this in never use. There are some clan war strats where you can use low noise on heavy tanks to cross somewhere unlit, but in reality in like public matches there's just no reason to use it. It's just so niche, it'll never matter. Optics, I'll put it in niche. Mostly just because on low tier heavy tanks maybe it will be useful if you put it on your KV1 or something. But high tier heavy tanks I would not use optics. They get good view range in general because they get this field mod, heavy tanks do. Periscope electric drive, so if you want to increase your view range just use that and then you'll get 465 or something for most heavy tanks, which is more than enough. Rotation mechanism, I'll put in useful but better options. Because this is only going to be useful if it's on a tank where you're already using a V-stab and you still want more gun handling. So T57 heavy, AMX 50B, and that's pretty much it, honestly. Rhino, maybe. I haven't played a Rhino before. Maybe a Kron. Never played that, but basically just auto-loading heavy tanks. There's no other tank that I would probably use this on. You could experiment with this piece of equipment on things which have slow traverse, hull and turret traverse, and put it over V-stab, but I have tried that on some tanks and I never really felt like it was better than a V-stab. Maybe, but I just can't think of a situation. Like I've tried it on 260, I'd preferred V-stab. V-stab I'll put in very good. I don't know if I should put these in necessary. I think I'm going to put these all in very good because it depends on the heavy tank. Some heavy tanks, it's not necessary. And I wouldn't say V-stab is necessary on all heavy tanks either. I would say the only necessary piece of equipment is rammer. But these are all like what you would pick next. Vents. I'll put it useful but better options. There's some tanks where vents might be useful. 50B, for example. T57 heavy tank maybe. But again, it's mostly just autoloaders. Any standard heavy tanks which can mount a rammer, you're going to run rammer and then V-stab, turbo of some kind, or hardening of some kind, and those are going to be your two loadouts. Aiming unit, I would say the same thing. I don't know exactly what order to put these in, but 50B, pretty much, that's it. 57 heavy, that's pretty much it. Fire control, I don't have a huge amount of experience with this, but I'm assuming it's the same as the rotation mechanism, where it's a very niche thing. Yeah, I think that's it for heavy tanks. Let's go on to the last one, tank destroyers. Okay. Tank destroyers, it depends on the tank destroyer, because as you can see, some tank destroyers like the T110E3, the Object 268 V4, they're kind of brawling, or the Badger, for example, they're kind of like, you kind of play them like heavy tanks, where you try to play either hull down or close range quarters, because they have good armor. Other TDs are like the Sturv, where you're just sniping, but in general, there's more reliance on your gun. So I'd put aiming unit up there as necessary or very good. I'll just leave it in very good for now. Binos, you are sitting still more in this tank, in tank destroyers, so I think it's useful, but I still think optics is better. You do have lower V range in TDs in general, like 360 base or 370 base, so binos kind of make a little more sense, but I still probably wouldn't use it on basically anything. Camo net, I know people want to use this on the Sturv, but please just use low noise. It's just better. I'm just gonna still put it and never use this, or I'll just put it in niche. It's not worth it. It just isn't. Low noise is just so much more useful. You're turning all the time, and I know in the Sturv, turning doesn't change anything, but it's just like you tap forward or reverse, or you're getting into position, and you're not getting any benefit. It's only when you're sitting completely still or turning without going forward or backwards. It's just, in low noise you get like 3/4 of the benefit of the camo net already. But that's at all times. It's just better. Fire control system, I could see this being useful on something like a 4K5. Probably put it above this. I'm gonna put this down here. Hardening, I would put this on very good, because it's good on like the T110E3, the Badger. I don't think there are too many TDs which have module damage problems, and the track health on TDs is more important because they don't have turrets usually. So I'd put bond hardening above experimental, but it's still, a good option. Turbo, a lot of TDs are very slow, and so on basically almost every TD I have a turbo loadout. 4K5, its reverse speed sucks balls. Same with a lot of the other TDs here. They have like 15 or less reverse speed, and unless you have like 20 plus reverse speed, turbo is like always an option. I'm looking at every single one of these tanks, and the only one that I might not run a turbo loadout on is like the Object 268. I might be missing one, but every single other one I'm looking at, I would probably run a turbo loadout, because they're either very slow or have terrible reverse speed. And I think both options are useful. 4K5, I would probably run experimental. Badger, maybe experimental. It's hard to say because it has bad bloom, but it's also very slow top speed wise. But like, E3, I probably would run bond. But I would probably put experimental above bond. But yeah, I would put it as one loadout for every TD. GLD, no. Fire control is just better. Grousers, I would only say this is useful on maybe a 268 version 4, but I haven't played it after the nerf. I just can't think of any other tank that doesn't reach its top speed easily. Maybe 268, but even then, I probably wouldn't run a turbo loadout on it anyways, or a mobility loadout, and if I did, I probably would just run turbo for the extra top speed and reverse speed. So I'll put it down in niche use. Config, I wouldn't bother. You know, most of these do not brawl, and if they do brawl, so they're not brawling, so they need more equipment for their gun, not for surviving. But even if they are brawling, I don't think many of them would really want to take it over just hardening, which gives you extra HP and protection to your modules. Low noise, I'll put it in useful but not better options, but better options, because I think it's useful in a couple, like maybe the Sturv. Could be useful on a secondary loadout for some of these tanks that are sniping, like the Grill 15, the Object 268. But in general, they're just better options. Optics, I'll put it here. I'm going to rearrange this a little bit. Radio set, I don't even think you can use, and it's not useful anyway. Rammer, 100% necessary. On almost every TD I run an aiming unit loadout, by the way, just because you're sniping so often on so many of them, and it's usually just the best option. Like, even if you're running like on an E3 or minnow, turbo hardening, and then the minnow you can't run a rammer, so I just run aiming unit. But even on an E3 or a Badger or something, which are just running rammer, turbo, hardening, your next best option for a second piece of for your third piece of equipment, after the rammer and turbo, for your secondary slot is probably going to be an aiming unit. So I would almost put aiming unit as necessary, because I don't think there's a single one of these tanks where I wouldn't run it. Maybe vents instead, but for a third piece of equipment, it's pretty good on a secondary loadout at least, if not first, depending on the tank. Rotation mechanism, I would put it in either very good or at the top of useful but better options. I think I'll put it in very good, because there are a lot of TDs which have very bad aim time or which turn very slow, and oftentimes both, like the 4005 and the 183. Rotation mechanism I think is really good on. Don't think it's bad on like some other tanks like the E4 either. Foch B it's good on for reducing intraclip bloom. Same with probably the Foch 155. It's just a solid piece of equipment. Grill 15 is good on for reducing bloom. So I would definitely put it in very good, but not necessary, because not all of these TDs need it. Vents, I'm going to put up with the... I think I'm going to put it at the top of very good. It's kind of like the aiming unit. These two I see as very similar pieces of equipment, because vents decreases your accuracy by 3.25% or so. Aiming unit does it by 8%, but they both decrease your accuracy, and this one just helps you reload by 3.25% as well. Those are the main benefits of it, as well as some view range. So it's kind of just what you prefer, the better accuracy or a little bit better accuracy but a little bit better reload and view range is the main takeaways from vents. Small liner, don't use it. V-stab, can't use it on TDs. Let's see, would I change any of this? I guess the takeaway for TDs is rammer, obviously. Turbo loadout, you need at least one. Usually I run it on both loadouts, and then I run hardening on one loadout, and then another aiming piece of equipment on the other, or two pieces of aiming equipment. Like on the grill, I'll run rotation mechanism, aiming unit, rammer, for one piece of one setup, but almost always turbo as one loadout. And then if it brawls, I do hardening for one loadout as well. I would say everything below this line I have never used on a TD a single time for pub battles. Like, I've never, Low noise is probably the closest I've come to bringing for like a stirve, but even then I don't think it's worth it. Um, this is just the bread and butter of what you want for tank destroyers. So maybe I should do a meme one for arty. Let's just see. Here's your arty equipment. Maybe I'll throw in a turbo just for the memes. Yeah, there's your arty equipment. All this other shit is fucking useless. So, yeah, there's your arty. That's all for this video. If you have any questions about how to set up tanks, more particularly like a specific tank, just let me know. I would say medium tanks are the hardest to set up because they have differing roles. Some of them are brawlers, some of them are more snipers, or they have two loadouts, one where they can brawl, one where they can snipe, or just be generally all around like good reload and stuff like with vents. But the rest are kind of straightforward. TDs, I guess, being the next hardest, and then you always have the awkward autoloaders that can't mount rammer, which usually use like a rotation mechanism, vents, or aiming unit as their third piece of equipment instead of the rammer. But V-stab, you know, hardening turbo, all that shit is kind of common on everything except for light tanks and TDs, which can't mount V-stab. But yeah, thank you all for watching. This was longer than I expected, but hopefully it was useful to you or entertaining at least. Expect possibly more videos on stuff like this in the future, where I go over basics in World of Tanks. This is kind of basics, but it was meant to be kind of entertaining at the same time. And let me know what you think about my choices in the comments. I want to know what you think. That's all for now. Goodbye.